No one expected the final act of Gene Hackman's life to unfold in such a chilling, enigmatic manner. Hollywood's immortal monument, a man who had once stood as a towering figure in cinema, did not fade into the night with a graceful farewell. There was no grand tribute, no last walk down the red carpet, no emotional final interview reminiscing on a lifetime of legendary performances. Instead, there was only silence, a haunting, oppressive silence that clung to the walls of his secluded Santa Fe mansion. And when that silence finally broke, it shattered into 1,000 unanswered questions. Gene Hackman did not pass away peacefully. His last breaths were not sighs of contentment but strangled cries, muffled and distorted by the thick walls of the house that had become his prison. The Santa Fe mansion, once a retreat from the clamor of Hollywood, had turned into a chamber of psychological torment. Love, loneliness, and silent manipulation entwined in a suffocating grip, holding him captive in his final days. But the true horror did not lie in the way he died, it lay in the secrets he left behind. A recording, whispered about in hushed voices, was said to contain his final words. A confession, a plea, a last desperate attempt to break free. But free from what? Or from whom? This was no ordinary tale of an aging legend retreating into obscurity. This was something darker, something that lurked beneath the surface, hidden behind the carefully drawn curtains and locked doors of the silent mansion. A life in the shadows. Gene Hackman had once commanded every frame he graced. From the French Connection to Unforgiven, his presence was raw, unyielding, a force that could not be ignored. He was the very embodiment of Hollywood's golden age, a relic of a time when talent had to fight, scream, and bleed to earn its place under the lights. But in 2004, at the height of his career, he walked away. No grand exit, no lengthy farewell tour, just a single statement announcing his retirement, followed by silence, while his peers clung desperately to relevancy with final roles, surprise comebacks, or sentimental reunions. Gene Hackman disappeared. He did not attend Hollywood events, refused interview requests, and avoided the nostalgia-driven retrospectives that often cemented an actor's legacy. Instead, he and his second wife, Betsy Arakawa, vanished into the vast, sun-drenched landscapes of Santa Fe, New Mexico. There, hidden among the arid hills and endless skies, they built a life removed from the noise of the world. But even in seclusion, whispers of their existence carried beyond the mansion's walls. Locals spoke of the eerie stillness surrounding their home. Mail carriers rarely saw the couple. Deliveries were left at the gate with no human contact. Even their closest neighbors, living mere hundreds of meters away, could not recall the last time they had seen Gene Hackman step outside. Once the face of American cinema, he had become nothing more than a shadow behind stone walls. A house of secrets. Rumors grew with the years. Some believed Gene was writing a secret memoir, an unfiltered account of his years in Hollywood. Others thought he was recording his thoughts, messages meant to be heard only after his passing. But the most unsettling whispers suggested that Betsy Arakawa, the woman who had stood by his side for decades, had encouraged, perhaps even enforced, his complete disconnection from the world. A single fragment of information, leaked from an unexpected source, fanned the flames of speculation. In 2023, a plumber called to the mansion for routine repairs claimed to have seen something peculiar on Gene Hackman's desk. An old-fashioned tape recorder with a handwritten note attached to it. The note read only 3 words. Final words, private. No one knew what the recording contained, or if it truly existed at all. But if it did, it had been made during Gene's weakest months, early 2024. When his health had begun to decline, and his once firm grasp on reality seemed to waver. Had he sensed something? Had he known that the days ahead would no longer belong to him? Or had the silent mansion already become his prison long before his final hour? The final descent. As the months passed, Gene's disappearance became more pronounced. He canceled his regular health checkups, ignored messages from old colleagues, and refused to respond to letters from the few friends who still reached out. A journalist, determined to check on his well-being, sent a letter directly to the mansion. The response that came back was chilling in its simplicity. A blank sheet of paper, carrying only 3 words, "Let me be." It was as if the Gene Hackman the world had known, the man who had once brought complex, layered characters to life, no longer existed. His final days inside the silent mansion remain a mystery. There were no emergency calls, no hospital visits, no final goodbyes. Only when weeks had passed without a sign of life did someone finally take action. A delivery person, concerned by the uncollected packages piling up at the gate, alerted the authorities. When the police arrived and forced open the doors, they stepped into a scene that sent shivers down their spines. Everything inside the house was meticulously arranged, as though frozen in time. The dining table was set for two. Two glasses placed perfectly opposite each other, each containing only a few drops of amber liquid. The beds were made, the books left open on their last read pages. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry. Only a single object stood out amidst the eerie stillness. The tape recorder, neatly placed among a pile of pristine white napkins. One of the investigators, his hands trembling, reached for the device and pressed play. Silence. The tape was empty. No voice, no message, nothing. But in the internal report, one detail stood out. A single silver strand of hair was found tangled at the bottom of the recorder. A reminder that someone had once held it, had once spoken into it. But whether the recording had ever existed, or whether it had been erased, remains a mystery. The legacy of the silent mansion. Gene Hackman's daughter, Leslie, was the first family member to step inside the house after the discovery. She did not cry. She did not protest. She simply stood in the doorway, staring at the space where her father had spent his final years. And then she spoke. They wrote their own script. I couldn't change it. To this day, she remains the only person rumored to have heard the lost recording. But when questioned about its contents, she offered no answers, no confirmation, no denial, just silence. The mansion remains empty, its heavy wooden doors locked, its windows covered in dust. Locals say they can still feel the weight of its past, lingering in the air like an unfinished symphony. The house, once a retreat, had become something else entirely. A tomb, a story without an ending, a whispering void where secrets lie buried deeper than any grave. And so, the question remains, what did Gene Hackman say on that final night? And who, if anyone, truly listened? The Silent Mansion. The isolated world of Gene Hackman in Santa Fe. Santa Fe, New Mexico, a place where the sky stretches endlessly, painted in hues of deep orange and crimson as the sun sets over the rugged desert hills. It is a land of silence, where the wind whispers across arid landscapes and the scent of dry earth lingers in the air. This was where Gene Hackman, one of Hollywood's most formidable legends, chose to vanish. For decades, Santa Fe had been known as a retreat for artists, poets, and those seeking solitude away from the fast-paced, artificial glow of Hollywood. But for Gene Hackman, it was more than just an escape, it was an erasure. A carefully curated exile, where the world he had once ruled as an actor became nothing more than a distant memory. His home, nestled in the outskirts of Santa Fe, became infamous among the locals. A grand yet uninviting estate, surrounded by high walls and an iron gate that remained perpetually locked. At first, it was merely another private residence of a retired star. But as the years passed and the stories grew, it became something more. People started calling it the Silent Mansion, the house that swallowed a legend. Unlike the grand Hollywood estates filled with luxurious parties and famous guests, Gene Hackman's Santa Fe mansion remained eerily still. No galas, no visitors, no paparazzi sneaking past the gates. Even those who lived nearby rarely saw signs of life within its walls. The mansion itself was a fortress of stone and glass, modern yet devoid of warmth. The architecture blended into the landscape, almost as if it were trying to disappear along with its owner. To those who passed by, it felt less like a home and more like a monument to isolation, a place where time stood still. Mail carriers recalled their unusual instructions: never ring the bell, never attempt to hand-deliver a package. Everything was to be left at the gate. Any attempt at direct interaction was met with silence. One delivery worker claimed he once caught a glimpse of movement behind the heavy curtains, a shadow. A fleeting presence, but nothing more. Even service personnel, those few who were granted entry to fix minor issues in the house, spoke of an eerie, unsettling atmosphere. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. The air inside felt heavy, as if it were carrying the weight of unspoken words, unshed tears, untold secrets. A plumber, hired for what should have been a routine repair, later recounted the feeling of being watched the entire time he worked. He never saw Jean or Betsy, but he felt their presence, silent, unseen, yet unmistakably there. But the most chilling detail was what he found on Gene Hackman's desk. An old tape recorder. A handwritten note attached to it. Final words, private. He never dared ask about it. He simply finished his work, collected his payment, and left. But he never forgot what he saw. A life cut off from the world. What makes a man sever all ties to his past? What compels someone to abandon a life of fame, admiration, and influence to live in self-imposed exile? Gene Hackman's retirement in 2004 had initially seemed like a personal choice. A well-earned break from the exhausting demands of Hollywood. But as time went on, it became clear that this was no ordinary retreat. He did not return for any nostalgic tributes. He refused interviews, declined invitations to industry events, and ignored all attempts at reconnecting with former colleagues. While other aging stars made surprise appearances, reviving their legacies, Gene stayed silent, and that silence was unsettling. His disappearance from public life was so absolute that even close friends admitted they no longer had direct contact with him. Some speculated that his wife, Betsy Arakawa, had been the architect of this isolation, encouraging him to cut all ties with his old world. Others believed that Gene himself had grown disillusioned, tired of the artificiality of fame, and had willingly buried himself in solitude. But no one knew for sure. There were whispers that he had been writing a memoir, a tell-all book that would expose the secrets of Hollywood. Others claimed he was recording his final thoughts, messages that would only be revealed after his passing. Whatever the truth, no one outside the mansion ever heard what Gene had to say. A pact that no one spoke of. One of the most disturbing rumors surrounding Gene Hackman's final years was what some referred to as the Final Pact. A whispered agreement between Gene and Betsy, one that ensured neither would ever have to live without the other. No one knew exactly when the pact had been made, but as the years passed, as Gene withdrew further into his isolation, some began to suspect that this was more than just a romantic promise. Friends who had once been part of his life were quietly cut off. His children from his first marriage, people who had once been close to him, found their calls going unanswered. Letters went unreturned. It wasn't just solitude, it was a slow, deliberate detachment from the world. Those who knew Gene in his younger years found it difficult to reconcile the man they remembered, strong-willed, independent, unafraid to challenge authority, with the figure he had become. A man whose every decision seemed to be filtered through one person. Betsy Arakawa. She was described by some as the love of his life. Others, however, saw something different. A woman whose influence over Gene was absolute. Whose quiet presence hid something deeper, an obsession, a need for control. Gene's final years were spent under her watchful eye. His health decisions, his daily routines, even his thoughts about the outside world, all seemed to pass through her first. And then, in the final months of his life, he stopped speaking to anyone outside the mansion entirely. The Vanishing Act. February 2024. The cameras outside the mansion were shut off. The security system was disabled. No calls were made from inside. No one was seen entering or leaving. The silent mansion had become a sealed box, cut off from the world entirely. Weeks passed, and no one heard a word from Gene or Betsy. Then, one day, a delivery worker noticed something strange. Packages had started piling up at the front gate. They hadn't been collected for weeks. Something was wrong. The authorities were called. When they forced open the front door, what they found was something out of a carefully orchestrated film scene. The house was untouched. The dining table was set for two, as if expecting a final meal that had never been eaten. Two glasses faced each other, containing only the last remnants of a drink. The curtains were drawn, allowing no sunlight to enter. And then there was the tape recorder. It was placed neatly on a table. Its presence deliberate. Someone had left it there, waiting to be found. But when an investigator pressed play, expecting to hear Gene Hackman's last words, there was nothing. The tape was blank. Had it been erased? Had it ever contained anything at all? Or had Gene Hackman's final confession been stolen, buried along with the truth of what had really happened inside the silent mansion? A house that speaks without words. Gene Hackman's daughter, Leslie, was the only family member allowed inside after the discovery. She did not cry. She did not ask for answers. She simply stood in the entrance, staring at the empty home, before whispering a single sentence. They wrote their own script. I couldn't change it. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened in the mansion. Was it a peaceful agreement between two people who had lived their lives on their own terms? Or was it something else, a secret? A decision made long before their final days arrived? The mansion still stands, untouched, a silent monument to a legend who disappeared long before his death was ever announced. Some say it is haunted, not by ghosts, but by something worse, by silence, by unanswered questions, by the weight of a story that no one was ever meant to hear. Whispers of control, the secrets and unsettling signs. In the quiet isolation of Santa Fe, behind the walls of the silent mansion, something was happening to Gene Hackman, something that those closest to him never saw coming. The man who had once been a symbol of power and authority on screen was slowly fading into the shadows of his own life. It wasn't just old age. It wasn't just a natural retreat from the world. It was something else, and the few people who stepped inside the mansion in its final years, workers, delivery personnel, and the rare visitor, began noticing unsettling details that suggested a darker truth beneath the silence. The tape recorder and the man who saw too much. In 2023, a plumber was called to the mansion for what should have been a routine job. A simple pipe leak, nothing out of the ordinary. He arrived at the gates, expecting a brief interaction, but as always, the instructions were clear. No unnecessary questions. No conversation beyond the task at hand. Finish the job quickly and leave. When he stepped inside, the house felt colder than expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The stillness wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. He noticed that most of the windows were tightly covered, blocking out the outside world entirely. Gene Hackman was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Betsy. Instead, a housekeeper led him to the area needing repairs. Her voice low, her manner hurried, as if she wanted him out as soon as possible. But it was when he walked past Gene Hackman's private study that he saw it, just for a second. Through the crack of a slightly open door. An old tape recorder. A single sheet of paper. Handwritten, taped to the device. Final words, private. It sent a chill down his spine. Something about the wording, about the deliberate placement of the note, felt wrong, like a message left behind, waiting for someone to find it. He wanted to ask about it, but something in the air, some invisible pressure, told him not to. He fixed the leak, he took his payment, and he left. Later, when he told the story to a friend, he couldn't shake the feeling that the tape recorder contained something important, something Gene Hackman had wanted the world to hear, but had been unable to say. But if that was the case, why was it never found? Had someone erased it? Or had someone made sure it was never played in the first place? Gene Hackman's fading presence. Those who had known Gene in his prime described him as a man of unwavering strength. He didn't let others control him. He chose his roles carefully, turned down million-dollar scripts without hesitation, and never backed down from his own beliefs. But the Gene Hackman of the Silent Mansion was different. By the time 2023 rolled around, he was barely in contact with the outside world. His health had started to decline, yet he refused to see doctors regularly. Even more concerning, his personality seemed to shift in ways that were difficult to explain. He no longer made his own decisions. His responses became more distant, as if they weren't truly his own. And in rare moments when he did interact with people, his words always seemed filtered, carefully chosen, rehearsed. A former friend, one of the last people who still tried to reach out to him, recalled receiving a final letter. A simple note, but one that unsettled them deeply. It read, "Betsy thinks I should rest more. I should stay quiet. I should listen." It didn't sound like Gene Hackman. It sounded like someone else was speaking for him. Or worse, someone else was thinking for him. The final pact. A love story or a prison? Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had been together for over 3 decades. To the world, they seemed inseparable, partners in every sense of the word. But behind closed doors, there were whispers of something far more disturbing. It started with small details, ones that only became clear in hindsight. Gene stopped contacting his children. At first, it was infrequent. Then, the phone calls became non-existent. His letters to them went unanswered, not because they didn't reply, but because, according to some sources, Betsy made sure he never saw them. Old friends were cut off. People who had worked with Gene for years, who had stood by him through the highs and lows of Hollywood, found themselves shut out. Even simple decisions went through Betsy. From meal plans to medications to who was allowed to visit. Nothing happened without her approval. But the most terrifying rumor revolved around the final pact. Somewhere in the depths of their isolation, it was believed that Gene and Betsy had made a chilling agreement, one that ensured neither of them would ever have to live alone. If one of them died, the other would follow. Not out of grief, not out of despair, but because they had decided, long ago, that their lives were too intertwined to be separated. A romantic gesture? Or something much more sinister? No one knew for sure. But what people did know was this. Betsy was obsessed with keeping Gene by her side. She had a fear of abandonment so strong that she refused to let anyone, even his family, take a part of him away. And when Gene Hackman's final days came, she was the only one who truly knew what happened inside the silent mansion. The unanswered questions. When authorities entered the house in early 2024, they found everything perfectly arranged. The dining table, the untouched glasses of amber liquid, the closed curtains, the eerie feeling of a home that had been prepared for something. But the most unsettling discovery was the one thing they didn't find. The tape recorder. It was gone. The same tape recorder that the plumber had seen a year earlier. The one labeled, "Final Words, Private." Had it been erased? Had it been destroyed? Or had someone, somewhere, ensured that whatever Gene Hackman had wanted to say would never be heard? Gene Hackman's daughter, Leslie, remained silent on the matter. She never revealed whether she had found anything in the mansion after the authorities left. But in one rare interview, when asked what she thought happened to her father in his final days, she gave an answer that only deepened the mystery. Some stories aren't meant to be told. To this day, no one knows the full truth about what happened inside the silent mansion. What was on the tape? Who made sure it was never played? And was Gene Hackman's final act truly his choice? Or was it something that had been decided for him long before his last breath? The Phantom Weeks. The haunting final days of Gene Hackman. The last weeks inside the silent mansion remain one of the greatest enigmas surrounding Gene Hackman's life. For years, his existence had been shrouded in mystery, with the outside world kept at a deliberate distance. But as 2024 approached, something changed. It was as if the mansion itself had swallowed its occupants whole, sealing them away from reality. No phone calls, no mail collected, no signs of life beyond the heavy curtains drawn tightly over every window. It was as if Gene Hackman and Betsy Arakawa had chosen to vanish before they were even gone. And when authorities finally broke through the doors, what they found inside sent chills through even the most seasoned investigators. The Vanishing Act. For a long time, the residents of Santa Fe were used to the quiet presence of the silent mansion. No one questioned why Gene and Betsy never appeared in public, why their home remained locked away behind imposing iron gates. But in the final weeks of Gene's life, that silence became even more suffocating. The house staff, once minimal but consistent, were dismissed without explanation. Gene's last scheduled doctor's appointment was abruptly cancelled. Even the security cameras surrounding the property, devices that had always been operational, were turned off on February 14, 2024, at exactly 5:32 p.m. From that moment on, there was no record of what happened inside. The only sign that something was deeply wrong came from the deliveries that stopped being collected at the front gate. Groceries, mail, even prescribed medications, all left untouched. At first, the delivery workers assumed it was a mistake. But as the pile of packages grew, so did their concerns. It took weeks before someone finally made the call to local authorities. And by then, it was already too late. A house preserved in time. When the authorities arrived, they expected resistance, a locked gate, a drawn-out process to gain entry. But to their surprise, the front door was unlocked. As they stepped inside, the first thing they noticed was the stillness. Not just the quiet of an empty house, but something far deeper. It was as if time had stopped within those walls. Nothing was out of place. The dining table was set for two, untouched, as though someone had prepared for a meal that never happened. 2 glasses of whiskey sat across from each other. only a few drops remaining at the bottom of each. The air inside was thick, stale, like a home that had been abandoned for years, even though everything suggested its occupants had only just left. But the most unsettling detail? Nothing showed signs of struggle. No overturned furniture. No broken objects. No notes left behind. Only an eerie perfection, like a staged scene waiting for its audience. The presence of something unseen. As investigators moved deeper into the house, they noted other disturbing details. In the bedroom, Gene's reading glasses were folded neatly beside an open book, one he would never finish. The sheets on the bed were barely disturbed, suggesting that neither he nor Betsy had truly slept in days. Then came the discovery of the medicine cabinet. Inside, authorities found an unsettling collection of sedatives, painkillers, and high-dose sleeping pills, the kind usually prescribed to patients with terminal illnesses. Yet, Gene Hackman's medical records showed no such diagnosis. So why were these medications present? And more importantly, who had been taking them? Some bottles were nearly empty, while others remained untouched, as if their use had been planned but never executed. It was clear that Gene and Betsy had been preparing for something. But what? And why had it been abandoned halfway? The tape recorder that wasn't there. Then came the most chilling absence. The plumber who had visited the mansion a year prior had spoken of a tape recorder. One that had a note reading, "Final words, private." But when authorities searched the study, the tape recorder was gone. Had it been destroyed? Or had someone taken it before the authorities arrived? If Gene had left behind a final message, it had been erased from existence. And whatever he had wanted to say before his last breath was now lost forever. A house that refused to speak. Leslie Hackman, Gene's daughter, arrived at the silent mansion a few days after the investigation began. She did not cry. She did not demand answers. She simply stood in the doorway, looking at the house that had taken her father in, and whispered. They were waiting for something. But it never came. She refused to elaborate on what she meant. Perhaps because she already knew the answer. Perhaps because she understood that whatever had happened inside those walls was never meant to be discovered. The truth buried forever. The final chapter of Gene Hackman's mystery. The truth, if there ever was one, had already slipped away before anyone could grasp it. By the time the authorities completed their investigation, the house had been searched. Every room inspected. Every object scrutinized, yet nothing truly explained what had happened in the silent mansion during Gene Hackman's final days. There were no signs of forced entry, no distress calls, no visible struggle, only absence, an absence that clung to the walls of the house like a ghost. A presence so heavy that even those who stepped inside claimed to feel it, an overwhelming, inescapable emptiness. Leslie Hackman, the daughter who came too late. When Gene Hackman's daughter, Leslie, arrived at the mansion, she was met with a sight that felt eerily staged. She stepped through the front door and found everything exactly as it had been left. The dining table, untouched. The whiskey glasses, only barely drained. The heavy curtains, blocking out all light. For years, Leslie had tried to reach her father, only to be met with silence. Letters unanswered, calls ignored. It had become clear that Gene had not been in control of his own isolation. And now, she was standing in the middle of a house that felt like a grave. Not just for her father, but for the truth. When asked about her reaction to the discovery, she simply said, "They wrote their own ending. I couldn't change it." The missing tape recorder. A secret that vanished. Among all the unanswered questions, one stood above the rest. The tape recorder. It had been there. A year before. The plumber had seen it. Had read the note attached to it. Final words, private. But now? It was gone. There was no sign of it in Gene Hackman's study. No mention of it in the police reports. Had it been erased? Hidden? Taken by someone before the house was searched? And if Gene had truly recorded his last words, what had he said? A final confession? A desperate plea? A warning? Or had he never gotten the chance to say anything at all? Did Betsy Arakawa control Gene until the end? Even in the wake of Gene's death, one person refused to answer any questions. Betsy Arakawa had always been fiercely private. But in the last years of Gene's life, that privacy had transformed into control. Gene stopped speaking to old friends. His own children were pushed out of his life. Every major decision about his health, his communication, Even his thoughts seemed to pass through Betsy first. And then there was the final pact, the whispered agreement that neither of them would have to live alone. If that pact had been real, what did it mean for Jean? Had he truly made that decision? Or had it been made for him? Was his silence in those final weeks his choice? Or had he been silenced? Whatever the answer, Betsy took it to the grave with her. And the one person who might have uncovered the truth, Leslie Hackman, chose to say nothing. The house that will never speak. To this day, the silent mansion remains untouched. No one has moved in. No one has dared to buy it. Documentary filmmakers who have tried to capture its story have reported strange occurrences, technical failures, distorted audio, lost footage. It's as if the house itself refuses to let the truth be told. Or perhaps there is no truth left to tell. Because whatever happened inside the silent mansion during those final days was never meant to be known. And so, the house remains a monument not to Gene Hackman's legacy, but to his silence.